Indeed, what is God's plan for doing the actual work of justice in the world? Well, once again, the answer from the Bible is very surprising, because it turns out that we're the plan, and that God doesn't have another plan. You're familiar with Micah chapter 6, verse 8, where it says, "He has told you, oh man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Isaiah 1:17 says, "Seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." For leaders like us who take the Bible seriously, there can be no doubt that God has given to us the work of justice in the world. Which brings us to the fundamental point of this session. If you want your leadership to matter, lead in the things that matter to God. And there can be no doubt that if you want to find yourself in the very center of God's beating heart, you will find it in God's passionate work for justice in His world. On the other hand, if you find yourself saying, "But God, justice is really just not my thing." If I find myself saying that, then I think God says to me, then I am not your thing. In fact, when the Pharisees were obsessing over their own invented religious priorities, Jesus firmly challenged them in Matthew 23:23 by telling them, "You've neglected the weightier matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faith." Indeed, I think most of us are actually so eager to have our leadership matter that we're willing to lead in whatever matters to God. But the truth is, leading in the struggle against massive, brutal injustice in the world, it feels intimidating. In fact, when you hear these stories and hear all of these statistics, you can just feel bolted to your chair with despair. But this then is the pivot point for great leadership. Leadership that matters to God and leadership that matters to God's people. You can see from Scripture and you sense in your own heart God's great passion for justice. You know justice matters to God. But honestly, the work seems hopeless, it seems scary and hard. And personally, I would rather lead people in things that feel cheerful and safe and easy. But if I think about it, that is not when leadership matters. People will pretty well take care of themselves in work that is cheerful, safe, and easy. On the other hand, leadership that actually matters, it matters precisely when the calling seems hopeless, scary, and hard. This then is the test that experienced leaders know well. How do we lead when the calling of God feels discouraging, when it feels frightening and really difficult? For more than a decade now, my colleagues and I at International Justice Mission have been trying to lead under precisely these circumstances. And so what have we learned? I'd like to try to address this as a three-part question. First, what have we learned about leading when the task seems hopeless? Second, what have we learned about leading when the task seems scary? And third, what have we learned about leading when the task is really hard? First, how do we lead when it seems hopeless? We lead by recentering the basis of our hope. Despair comes from focusing our eyes on what we can do. Hope comes from refocusing our eyes on who God is and what He wants to do. Hope is recovered when we remember this: if God is passionate about getting it done, then He is also responsible for getting it done. For the disciples that Jesus raised up to lead the early church, this was a difficult lesson to learn. And in fact, if you want to see hopelessness, Look at the disciples when Jesus told them to feed 5,000 people. Do you remember this story? Jesus has been teaching for a long time, right? And the disciples go to Jesus because everybody's getting hungry, and the disciples say, no, Jesus, why don't you send everyone home now so they can get themselves fed? And Jesus, he doesn't want to miss out on the fun of this situation. And so he says to the disciples, no, you guys just feed them. And the thing I always love about the disciples is that they're always just so patient to explain to Jesus what he doesn't understand about the situation. And they say, oh, Jesus, we would love to do that, but there's 5,000 hungry people. And it would take a half year's wages to be able to do that. And, we just really don't have that kind of cash on us today. So, back to you, Jesus. See, it's interesting because there was nothing unclear about what it is that he asked them to do, right? But they looked at the magnitude of the need, and then they looked at their own puny resources, and they thought, well, this can't have anything to do with me. So then what does Jesus say? Very interesting. He simply asks, well, what do you have? Well, they don't have nothing, and so they have to bring forward what they do have, which, if you remember, it's the little boy with the sack lunch that his mom had packed for him to go hear Jesus, and it's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And this is then presented as the corporate resources that are going to meet the massive need. And this is where the Apostle Andrew enters the conversation, because I think he has a graduate degree in public policy from Harvard or something. And he looks at the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he says, what are these among so many? See, this would be me, honestly, because I went to college and I took a math course, and you've got 5,000 hungry people and 5 loaves and 2 fish. And frankly, if you were as sophisticated as I am, and if you understood the deeper sociological roots of the situation, you'd see there's really nothing for us to do but to sit in the paralysis of despair. But what does Jesus say? He simply says, give it to me. What do you have? Will you give it to me? And in that moment, Jesus takes responsibility for the miracle and proceeds to feed 5,000 people to overflowing. You notice he didn't ask the disciples for what was needed. He simply asked them for what they had, and would they give it to him so that he could do the miracle. If God is passionate about getting it done, he is also responsible for getting it done. When my IJM colleagues in Kenya received the case referral about David's case, the whole ugly tragedy seemed hopeless. The policemen who were supposed to be the ones we would turn to stop violence were actually the ones who were committing the violence and then covering it up. No one in David's community had ever seen the police brought to justice for this kind of brutality. And so my IJM colleagues, they just cried out to God. They offered to God their commitment to not go away until justice was done. And lo and behold, the God of justice did a miracle. He used their courageous advocacy to release David from prison and to return him to his home. And while David is out of jail, the 5 police officers who assaulted him have been charged for their crimes. And IJM Kenya's legal staff continue to stand with David and to make sure that his case is brought to justice. Now David is no longer rotting in prison. I'll tell you where he is. He's in school taking courses on legal advocacy. And now he volunteers with his church community to make sure that those who don't have a voice have a man of justice on their side. By offering all that they had to God, but only what they had, David and my IJM colleagues are starting to change the calculation about what the police can get away with in their community. And it's glorious. Sometimes God is calling you to lead in a work that seems hopeless. In such moments, we need to remind our people that the work is God's. That he has simply asked us to give what we have. and that the required miracles are his job, not ours.